Okay, hello there, thrill seekers. That was a little piece of the James Bond theme, mainly because I tried to do a song by The Who, and it didn't work out. The reason I tried to do a song by The Who is I went this weekend and saw a high school performance of The Who's Tommy in a local high school here in Ontario, California. It was amazing. Oh my God. Anyway, so today I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about Dogen's Shobogenzo Zui Monki, which I mentioned last week. So, one of the most confusing things about studying Dogen is that there are three, look at me doing European style, count them, three books by Dogen called Shobogenzo. So, we have Shobogenzo itself, which is just called Shobogenzo, which means Treasury of the True Dharma Eye. And this is volume 1 of the 4-volume version put out by my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, and his student Mike Cross. There's another one called Shinji Shobogenzo. So that was the famous Shobogenzo. That's the one I always talk about, okay? The other one is Shinji Shobogenzo, which means something like true character Shobogenzo, and by character I mean written character as in letter, because Chinese characters. So this is a collection of koans compiled by Dogen when he was living in China. None of this is his original stuff, though. This is just a collection of ancient koans, so it's not really written by Dogen as such. And there is Shobogenzo Zui Monki, which does not mean Shobogenzo for sea monkeys, but it does mean Shobogenzo, a record of things heard, something like that. And that's the one I want to talk about. This is the newest edition put out by Wisdom Publications in, let's find out when it was put out so we don't get this wrong, 2022. And it's translated by Shohaku Okumura, who is one of my favorite Dogen writers in contemporary times. He's a Japanese Zen monk and master, I suppose you could say, who has lived in the United States. I think in Indiana is where he lives right now. He's lived in the U.S. for 40 or more years, I think. So he's a really good person to translate this because he understands Zen, he understands the Japanese language, and he understands the English language very well. So very good translation. Let's see. Previous editions of this book include one called A Primer of Soto Zen, a translation of Dogen's Shobogenzo Zui Monki by Reiho Masunaga. And then there's this one, Shobogenzo Zui Monki. This is also translated by Shohaku Okumura, I believe. Let's make sure. Yes. And it follows a different edition because apparently there are two sort of ancient versions of Shobogenzo Zui Monki, and this is one. And then it just seems like Okumura Roshi decided that the other version was better or more reliable, and so he translated from a different version. Anyway, don't worry about that. So let me tell you what this is. This is not written by Dogen. So even though we have Eihei Dogen as the title, Dogen is a Dharma name, and Eihei means Eiheiji, the temple that he lived in. And we don't really know. I once tried to find out what Dogen's real name was, his given name. Nobody knows. So we just call him Dogen from Eihei. So this was compiled by a student of his named Koun Eijo. So Eijo was Dogen's Dharma heir. After Dogen decided to step down when he got very ill, he made Eijo his Dharma heir. And Eijo compiled this between the years 1234 and 1238, and it seems to have been taken down as notes for his own use. It doesn't seem to have ever been intended for publication or wide dissemination. This is something that Eijo kept his own little diary of what Dogen said. And it was found, I think maybe after Eijo's death, that the intro has the specifics. I'm not remembering exactly the specifics, but sometime after Eijo was not able to complain about it, somebody put this together and made it a public document. So that's why we got it now. Now, I want to talk first about this edition, because this particular edition, which was put up by Wisdom Publications in 2022, is that what I said? Anyway, it's great. This is really, really good. It's a very, I always say you can judge a book by its cover, because that phrase, you can't judge a book by its cover, was coined back in the days when every book essentially had the same cover. They just had a plain cover with the title on it. But I think this cover is real nice. It makes it look very classy. It's got this little thing. I don't know. I always like little touches like this. It's got the little ribbon in there so you can find your place, which is kind of nice. And one thing I especially like about it, which those of you who are watching and not just the audio version but watching the YouTube version can see this, it has the Japanese original on the facing page of the English translation, which makes it very useful if you want to know, if you see something, if you know some Japanese and you want to look up like, what did Dogen actually say, because this translation might sound a little weird or whatever. I didn't find that very often in this at all, that the translation sounded off to me. But sometimes you want to check, if you're me, sometimes you want to check and see what the deal is with these things. So as far as an edition of Shobogenzo Zui Monki goes, this is the one. You can't really beat it. It's not like the other two are bad, but this one is just so good and so complete and so thorough. You couldn't really beat it. So, as I mentioned last week, my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, I think it was this one. I'm pretty sure it was this one. I showed him this one time when I was studying and practicing with him because I found it somewhere. And I said, hey, what do you think of this? This is supposed to be by Dogen. It's Dogen's Shobogenzo Zui Monki. And he said, I don't think that is a very reliable book. And as I said last week, I didn't know at the time, and I never clarified with him whether he meant this translation was not reliable or the book itself. But now I'm starting to think, after having read the book, that maybe Nishijima Roshi was referring to the book itself. And here's the reason. Okay, back when I was a little young whippersnapper, I was very fond of Kurt Vonnegut Jr., the science fiction. I guess he transcended science fiction, but he was a writer who wrote a lot of science fiction novels and then wrote mainstream novels too. And I liked his books a lot, and I would just read whatever ones I could get. And I remember after I'd read several of his books, of Kurt Vonnegut's books, I came across one called Player Piano. And I knew somehow I knew that this was his first published novel. And I remember reading it going, ooh, I didn't think it was a bad book or anything, but I was kind of going, where's Kurt Vonnegut in this? It didn't sound like a Kurt Vonnegut novel. I guess he hadn't developed his signature style by then, and he was probably at the mercy of an editor who may have tried to smooth out his prose to make it sound more normal, because Kurt Vonnegut, if you ever read his books, has a very kind of interesting and unique way of expressing himself. Well, I kind of felt the same way reading Shobogenzo Zui Monki. I'm like, where's Dogen? Where's the Dogen?
Where's the beef?
Like, it just was like, it didn't sound like Dogen. Well, let me just read you what Okumura Roshi has to say about this. He says, fundamentally, Zui Monki can be read as a highly practical manual of Buddhist practice. Dogen's words express fundamental aspects of Buddhist practice in terms that are both concrete and straightforward in Japanese society in the 13th century. And he mentions the topics that are covered. Let me find that for you. Okay. Here are the topics that he covers in this book. Arousing sincere aspiration, the mind of awakening or Bodhi mind. Seeing impermanence. The importance of monastic practice with others. Following one's teacher and the Buddhist teachings. Freedom from personal views. Giving up worldly sentiments. Parting from the egocentric self. Casting aside clinging to body and mind. Practice without gaining mind, living in poverty. My God, he talks about living in poverty a lot. I mean, I would have put that number one. It just seems like, well, I don't know, because Okumura Roshi has kindly showed all the places where he talks about this, but it seems like he just never shuts up about that. not seeking fame and profit, having compassion or parental mind and working to benefit others, harmony with others, concentrating on one practice in exclusion for trying to do everything, and shikantaza. Shikantaza is the style of meditation. He talks about shikantaza a lot. But there is very little, I would say almost none, of the sort of lofty philosophy and really interesting sort of stuff that one finds in, for example, Shobogenzo. It's almost unphilosophical, this book. It's almost just like, I kept thinking that if history had worked out differently, and we didn't have Shobogenzo, because it could have worked out that way. Shobogenzo was Dogen's masterwork. It was his main thing that he was working on for his whole life, was writing this giant piece of literature, Shobogenzo. But basically, after Dogen's death, Shobogenzo was not read very widely. There were a few fans of it among Buddhist monks in the Soto sect, but it wasn't as if, most normal people in the Soto sect of Zen Buddhism were sitting around reading Shobogenzo the way Christians might read the Bible. It wasn't like that at all. It was kind of relegated to a very small cadre of intellectual sort of monks or very mystical-minded monks who were interested in it and kept it alive. But if those guys hadn't done a good job of keeping it alive, we might have been left with nothing. Dogen's movement, his Soto Zen Buddhism, became a big deal in Japan, became the biggest form. I don't know if it's the biggest form of Buddhism. It's certainly the biggest form of Zen Buddhism, as in most number of temples and things in Japan. It might be the number one form of Buddhism in Japan. I'd have to look that up. But anyway, so the point is it became a big deal. But not on the basis of people reading Shobogenzo, on the basis of other things about how they were able to reach out to the community and make themselves available and build temples and so on and so forth, but not on Shobogenzo. So, if instead of Shobogenzo itself, we'd been left with Shobogenzo Zui Monki, I don't think Dogen would be a very interesting character or a very interesting person philosophically. He might be very interesting as the guy who brought this form of Buddhism to Japan and so forth, those kind of things, and started a movement. But as far as being a philosopher, if you just read this, you'd be like, okay. It's not much in here that you couldn't find in a dozen other different Zen Buddhist monks talking about how to practice and how important it is to be nice to everybody and live in poverty and etc., all those things I told you about. One little thing, though, I should point out that I've quoted in some of my books. Let me find it. In this edition, it appears in 2.7. So there are 6 books in scare quotes in this. So this is book 2, number 7. Apparently the ordering is different between this and the other version of Shobogenzo Zui Monki, so it's not 2.7 in the other one, but it's 2.7 here. And it has this line: even when we speak rationally while another person says unreasonable things, it is wrong to defeat the person by arguing logically. On the other hand, it is not good to give up hastily saying that we are wrong even if we think we are actually correct. Neither defeat the person nor withdraw by saying we are wrong. It is best just to leave the matter alone and stop arguing. And that I always thought was really good advice, and I picked up on that years ago, and I've put that in a few of my books. There's another piece which those of you who are familiar, like the 2 or 3 of you out there who might be familiar with early versions of Shobogenzo Zui Monki, might remember a little passage about eating meat, which was also kind of interesting to me because I'm a vegetarian, and I was a vegetarian before I ever became a Buddhist. Before I ever got interested in Buddhism, I was interested in vegetarianism. And it appears in this version of Shobogenzo Zui Monki. This is the version put out by the Soto Shu Shumucho, and it's also translated by Shokaku Okamura, but it's from the other edition. And this piece doesn't appear in the new edition that I just told you about, but I want to read it to you because I think it's interesting as a vegetarian. On one occasion, Dogen said, "In the assembly of Zen Master Basho, There was a monk who, when he was sick, wanted to eat meat. The master allowed him to do so. So monks weren't supposed to eat meat. So his master allowed him to do so because he was sick. One night, the master himself went to the infirmary and saw the sick monk eating meat in the dim lamplight. A demon was clinging to the monk's head, eating the meat. Although the monk thought he was putting it in his own mouth, it was not him, but the demon who was eating the meat. After that, whenever a monk fell ill, the master allowed him to eat meat because he knew he was possessed by demons. So this is one of these interesting stories. I remember my first teacher, Tim, had told me about this story because Tim was a semi-vegetarian. He wanted to be a vegetarian, but he had some health problems, so it's kind of like he followed this. He kind of ate a little bit of meat. He used to say, I'm a liberal vegetarian, which is sort of like being a liberal celibate. Like, I'm a celibate, but I sometimes F. That was his joke about that. Anyway, kind of interesting, but it doesn't appear in the other version. So there is obviously some kind of discrepancy among the different versions, which could indicate that what we have now might not be exactly the same as what Eijo himself wrote. The oldest copies, it says here, I've forgotten the dates, but the oldest copies we have date from, I think, 400 or more years after Eijo's death. So, who knows what happened during that time? Who knows what changes were made? Because often these kind of texts change a lot. Now, one of the few sort of philosophical bits in this book, which I think is kind of good, shows up in this 317, in this, as I keep referencing the new edition of Shobogenzo Zui Monki. Someone asked, how do you feel about the following view? Upon hearing that one's own self is the Buddha Dharma and that it is futile to seek anything outside of oneself, what if students who believed this deeply gave up their practice and studies and spent their whole lives doing good and bad things according to their personal nature? So this is a kind of a variation on a common sort of problem a lot of people have with Buddhism, because Buddhism says that the true reality is what you are, ordinary mind, you just as you are. So why do you practice and study? This gets addressed a lot of times in Shobogenzo, famously in Genjo Koan, which I talked about maybe a week ago or something, or 2 weeks ago. Anyway, here's what Dogen says at this juncture. He's getting asked this question for, the 100th time. In this point of view, there is a discrepancy between the person's words and reality. To give up practice and abandon study because of the futility of seeking anything outside sounds as though something is being sought in the very act of giving up. This is not non-seeking. So this is not what we're talking about when we say non-seeking. We simply verify that practice and study themselves are the Buddha Dharma. Without seeking anything, we should refrain from engaging in worldly affairs and unwholesome actions, even if we are inclined to engage in them. We should continue to study and practice the way being Buddhism, even if we have become languid and weary. So keep studying, keep doing the practice. It's a nice answer. Nobody's ever satisfied with any of Dogen's answers to that question, but I like that one. I thought that one was pretty good. So my summary judgment of Shobogenzo Zui Monki is, if you're interested in Shobogenzo Zui Monki, this new edition from Wisdom Publications is definitely the one to get. I mean, I don't think it could be surpassed, and it certainly hasn't been surpassed in the past. Ooh, that was some weird alliteration. But the problem for me is it almost doesn't sound like Dogen. Like, if you want to get Dogen's deep philosophical stuff, go to Shobogenzo, but Shobogenzo is a brain twister and very difficult. Often, and this is pointed out in the introduction, often people will recommend Shobogenzo Zui Monki to people, these are Zen teachers, will recommend this book to people who find Shobogenzo too difficult, because this is much easier to understand. But as I say, not very philosophical. It's mostly just practice, do good, be nice, live in poverty over and over again, the standard stuff. So there you have it. That's my review. It's like I say, I praise this version of Shobogenzo Zui Monki for what it is, and now I understand why Nishijima Roshi said it was unreliable, because it almost doesn't even sound like Dogen. So I don't know if Nishijima Roshi thought that maybe it wasn't really Dogen's words and it was kind of a made up document, or if he just thought, I don't know. Who knows why Eijo, let's take it as given that Eijo really did write this, Dogen's closest student, why he chose these particular bits to emphasize. Maybe he was looking for a way to make Dogen more accessible to people who didn't understand his deep and lofty philosophy. I don't know. But there you have it. That's my review of Shobogenzo Zui Monki. And for those of you who are concerned about my health, I'm feeling better, but not completely better. So we'll see what goes on from here. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But generally much better than I was when I made that video last week about being sick. So thank you for your support and thank you for your well wishes. All right, if you want to continue to support me in other ways, you can go to the URL that you are seeing on the screen below, or that you are about to hear if you're listening to the audio version, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. That's where you can send, you'll find links to send things via PayPal and Patreon, and those are my main and usually my only ways of living, and I appreciate your support. But as I always say, you don't got to support me if you don't want to support me. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. All right, Ziggy, what did you think of Shobogenzo's Wee Monkey? You didn't read it at all. You just saw me reading it. Well, it was all right. It was good enough. We'll talk to you later, Ziggy. Bye.